Welcome to our webinar, Who or What UN COP Does It Matter and Climate Justice. Before we begin, all of us at the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and respectfully acknowledge that our advocacy, education, and our learning across the country takes place on the occupied and unceded lands of many Native American tribes. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its long history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this country, and whose practices and spiritualities were, are, and shall always be tied to the land and the water. Today's webinar is the 9th and final webinar in our 2022 Climate Justice webinar series as part of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program. The CHEF Fellowship is a program that recognizes the need for more diversity in climate and health leadership and a sharper focus on equitable climate solutions. The goal of the fellowship is to empower doctors of color from populations that face greater effects and are underrepresented in medicine to become leaders in climate and health equity, education, advocacy, and policy solutions. I'm Dr. Bernice Curry, the Western.
I know it's not a formula, but you know.
Please mute ourselves. I'm Dr. Bernice Curry, the Western Associate Director of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program. Also joining me from the consortium to run the webinar is our Program Assistant, Clarissa Payton, and our Program Manager, Jordan Curry Carter. Clarissa will assist through the chat to answer any technical questions during the webinar. Our other team members on the webinar are Program Manager, Dr. Kimberly Williams, and Dr. Mark Mitchell, the Program Director, who you will hear from shortly. The webinar series is hosted by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on our website for future viewing as part of the Equity Resources page on the consortium's website. Today, we are really honored to have Dr. Laalitha Surapaneni, Assistant Professor in the Department of General Internal Medicine, Ms. Patricia Cochran, Inupiaq Elder, who serves as Executive Director of the Alaska Native Science Commission, and Dr. Michael Charles Dene, a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and a Provost New Faculty Fellow and Assistant Professor with the Department of Biological and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University. Rather than use our time to provide descriptions of their impressive work, we are placing a link to their bios in the chat. As healthcare providers, it's important that you consider the role that healthcare systems and providers play in regards to climate and health. In this webinar, we will depart from our usual format and instead have a panel discussion. Dr. Mark Mitchell will provide a brief background and context of the aspects of the Conference of the Parties, otherwise known as COP. He will then pose questions to our panel of speakers. So Dr. Laalitha Surapaneni and Ms. Patricia Cochran are recent COP participants. Dr. Michael Charles is currently joining us from COP27 in Egypt. They will share highlights, unique insights, and questions regarding their personal experiences and the value of attending COP and the role that health professionals, Indigenous peoples, youth, and climate justice advocates can fulfill with their engagement. The general format for today's webinar will be one 10-minute presentation by Dr. Mitchell, a 30-minute discussion from our 3 speakers, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers with our audience. We ask that you put your comments and links to any resources that you may recommend or any questions that you may have for the presenters in the chat box at any time during the presentation. We will get to as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A period. We ask that you please keep yourself muted so we are not interrupted by any background noise. Dr. Mitchell, you may begin.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. So let me begin by sharing my screen. I've got as Dr. Curry said, we have a brief presentation. And let me get to a full screen. So the title of this presentation is Who or What is a UN COP, and why does it matter for health and climate justice? So the United Nations, so here are some of the definitions. I thought I'd start with some definitions that are helpful to when talking about United Nations negotiations, and particularly around the UN COP, the 27th UN COP, which is happening now in Egypt. So the United Nations, the UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and under this convention, the whole world has agreed to stabilize greenhouse gas concentration levels at a level that would prevent dangerous human-induced interference with the climate systems. And this is being sponsored by the United Nations Environmental Program section of the United Nations bureaucracy. And we talk about COP, the COP. The COP stands for Conference of Parties, and this is the global decision-making body that meets, and the parties are actually countries. And so these are their conferences, their meetings to make decisions. There are within this agreement, within this framework convention or agreement, there are the bodies of text, and there are annexes. And there is a description of the Annex 1 parties. And these are the countries, the developed countries, that are specifically called upon to reduce their greenhouse gases to the level in 1990, to the level that they were in 1990. These are originally 38 countries, including a number of Eastern European countries. Annex 2 parties are developed countries that are called not only to reduce the greenhouse gases, but also to provide financial assistance to developing nations and to report their greenhouse gas emissions and sinks or reductions of greenhouse gases to the full COP. So these are the countries that are parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The green countries are the Annex 1, are in both Annex 1 and 2. The blue countries are only in Annex 1, and the yellow countries are non-annex parties. So again, the blue countries are the ones that are going to be required to, the blue and green countries are required to reduce their emissions. The green countries are going to be expected to contribute to reducing the and tracking greenhouse gas progress in the yellow countries and worldwide. So the history of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is that it started in New York City, actually, in 1992. In the United Nations, they generally meet on a different continent every year. And so they started in May of 1992 with an Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC. And what they did was to develop the language for the convention. And the language was to commit to substantial reductions in greenhouse gases to prevent the anthropogenic interference with the Earth's climate system. So the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development followed shortly afterwards. This conference is typically called the Rio Summit or the Earth Summit, and that was in June of 1992. There, they actually adopted the convention language that had been negotiated earlier and opened it up for signature for countries to become party to the convention. 154 nations eventually signed on to the UN Framework Convention. And the Conference of Parties meets every year, has been meeting every year since 1995. Some of the major COPs that have occurred since then are the Kyoto and Paris. So the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997, and it actually set legally binding reductions on Annex 1 parties for the 2008 through the 2012 time period in order to keep, it demanded reductions in greenhouse gases in order to keep below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. However, the US and China were not parties to, they did not adopt the Kyoto Protocol. So they did not, we did not agree to reduce our greenhouse gases at that point. In COP21 in 2015, the Paris Agreement was negotiated. We decided that that the Kyoto Protocol was not enough, and that it was important to get the US and China involved. And of course, so that was a major accomplishment under the Obama administration to get an agreement that would bring both the US and China into the UNFCCC. So by this time, the Paris Agreement was adopted by 196 governments, virtually all governments, and it is legally enforceable. But each country actually sets their own goals. That's their nationally determined contribution, or NDC. And these goals were set to keep the world's average temperature well below the 2 degrees centigrade, preferably below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And this was, a lot of this was at the demand of the small island nations that said that they could not withstand a 2 degree rise in global temperatures, that the sea level rise would endanger many of the small island nations. And so there was agreement to try to focus, to try to get 1.5 centigrade or below. And so this time the US and China actually did ratify the Paris Agreement. So we're now in COP27 in Egypt, and the UN Environmental Program is focusing on climate adaptation, climate finance, and a just transition that takes into account the development needs of countries and groups most affected by the climate crisis. And so just so you know that that the Paris Agreement is legally binding, but that the goals again were set by the country. It is a enhanced transparency framework. It's in cooperation with another UN treaty negotiation, the Biodiversity Treaty. Biodiversity limits the amount, helps to limit the amount of climate change, but climate change is reducing biodiversity dramatically. So these two treaty negotiations go hand in hand. In the U.S. Senate must approve treaties. However, if they're not treaties, if they're conventions or agreements, they don't actually have to approve the treaty. They have to have they have to consent with the treaty, but they don't have to consent to international agreements or accords. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we will go to the panel discussion. So if I can ask the panelists to turn on your cameras, and if others could keep your cameras off, that would be good. So so my first question is if you can describe your experience with the climate change COPs. Have you been there? All of our panelists have been to climate change COPs. I'm curious as to how many and in what capacity you have attended the COPs. So, Michael, can you go ahead and start?
Sure, I can start. So hello, everyone. I'm Michael. I'm actually calling in from Egypt at COP27 right now. This is my 5th COP. So I've been working over the last 6 years. Mostly started this work from a youth perspective, organizing youth from around the US with a group called Sustain Us. And then kind of since then, on climate change. And so I've been working with them mostly for the last 4 years.
Okay, thank you. And Patricia?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I have been attending COPs for a long period of time, although I will say I have not gone in the last several years. Michael, I'm very glad that you're there. I started, I think my first COP was in Kyoto, so it's been a while. Yeah, I've been involved for quite a number of years and spent about 10 years or so doing COPs during my tenure as the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Right, yes. Okay, great. And Lolita?
Hi, yes, so I'm a physician and last year was my first COP at COP26. So I went as what's called an observer. So, you know, people who are not part of the, what's the official party badge, as you were saying, Mark. So I was part of a research institution. So as the university delegation there to represent the health voice at COP.
Great. Yeah. So tell me what you think has been accomplished with the COPs so far. Does it really matter? Who wants to take that?
Well, I can start and share a little bit of my my history and background. As I said, I served as the international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council for a number of years. ICC is an international organization that represents the 160,000 plus indigenous peoples of Alaska, Canada, Russia, and Greenland. So we're also part of the Arctic Council, the 8-member Arctic Council, and part of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So those were sort of the hats that I was wearing during my time at COP meetings. I can tell you honestly, I think things have changed and hopefully for the better over the years. Certainly, as Indigenous people, when we first started out, I will say that we were barely recognizable, barely heard, barely seen during any of the COP meetings, and it was a difficult time to be involved. Things have changed, and I think they've gotten better over the years. I'll also say that truthfully, during the negotiations is hardly the time that you can have a lot of influence over what happens at the COPs. The best times that I ever found at all of the COPs that I've been to was a week prior to the actual beginning of the COP program, the negotiations and the teams that come in from all of the states and other places to talk about the agreements to be made. It's what happened at those pre-meetings was really the heart and the soul of what COP should be about. It's not really about the agreements that come out of there that are really and truly important, but really all that leads up to it, because that's where all the communities and the nations get together, is in that week before, when we have time to really sit down and do discussions and sessions and interviews, meeting with elders, with youth, with the individual Indigenous people from all of those regions. We have very little say-so over what happens actually at the negotiations table itself. And I found that to be pretty distressing. We had much easier time in working with places outside the US than we did within our own US delegation. We would get great support from Bolivia, from the Philippines, from other places like that. But we had a hard time breaking into the US delegation. And if you weren't part of the negotiating team, it was difficult to be heard or seen. Hopefully that has changed, and I hope, Michael, that you're having a much better experience than mine during the earlier days of COPs.
Yeah, so Michael, have things gotten better over the time that you've been there?
Yeah, yes and no. I would say the one thing I completely still agree with is, we asked the question of like, what does COP do, and is it kind of worth it, or is it working? And I think the best thing it does is bring communities together from around the world. I found that you get to kind of either continue doing the work despite being exhausted through the time here is coming from building that community and meeting other people from around the world, hearing their stories, telling your story, and finding ways to kind of stay connected and find ways to keep working together and uplift each other's stories, both there in the international space, but also back home. And I think in terms of the visibility and access, I think that kind of has grown and gotten better and better. I think one of the greatest things we've seen specifically is the increase in Indigenous youth. So at COP25, I think there was at least 3 delegations of Indigenous youth, if not 4, from Canada, US, New Zealand, or the Pacific as a whole. And I know we hosted an event with maybe, I want to say 40 to 50 Indigenous youth from around the world together, representing all the different regions, with different amounts of like representation. But it was one thing that was huge to see, and that was 2 COPs ago, and 4 COPs ago there was maybe 4 of us there as Indigenous youth, kind of under 25 maybe. So that was very interesting and really cool to see that kind of immediate growth for the aspect of bringing in Indigenous youth. I think in general, the ability to kind of build in that access, specifically, I'll talk in the US context, has grown a bit, just where the visibility, I think, of Indigenous peoples is growing broadly, not just within climate, but across all kind of aspects of society right now. And I think we're seeing a lot more language specifically talking about Indigenous peoples. In COP24 was kind of when we actually operationalized a framework for a platform for Indigenous peoples. So now it adds more days for the prep work, where we have a facilitative working group. So that was kind of one of the bigger formal seats that we did hold as Indigenous peoples. So we have seen, there have been wins along the way. And I think a lot of that we try to keep remembering and being very thankful for all those that have been working on this for years, because it took 20, 30 years of dedication of other Indigenous leaders to really get us to this point, and we're starting to see things move. I mean, I usually meet with the State Department 2-3 times. We have a good amount of bigger organizations that are kind of growing, and we've been able to build out that kind of inside scoop as well. And I think it's also helped having elected Native people in positions. We've met with Deb Holland last year, and John Kerry this year. We've also have a Navajo woman who's the head of the tribal energy project under the DOE, and so has also helped us be a good access point to meeting with the State Department and the White House climate advisors. So I think a lot of things are growing in terms of the actual outcomes of, what we say to the US and how it impacts the overall international negotiation. Who knows what impact we're really making there? But one thing that we have kind of learned how to do is what are specific lines of text that we can use and really try to fight for. We try to pick out a few different things and really have specific focuses when it comes to strategy for policy specifically, and trying to figure out what are the ways that we can kind of protect our people as we start trying to do all of this action and doing it quick, and making sure that we're not making vulnerable people even more vulnerable as we kind of commit to these big amounts of money and quick implementation. So yeah, I'll just kind of go with that, but just kind of wanted to follow. And I think we focus mostly on the Indigenous peoples aspect, but I think in general, we're starting to see a lot of different groups kind of having a similar experience of building better access and finding ways to make some different impacts at these conferences.
Yeah, so Lolita, obviously last year was your first COP and you're new to that. And so did you think that you were being heard, that it made a difference being there? Before you do that, can you say where you're from?
Definitely. Yeah, I'm currently based in Minneapolis. I'm originally from India. I practice here in Minneapolis. I'm also a member of Health Professionals for Healthy Climate, which is a local Minnesota group, and nationally I'm on the board of Physicians for Social Responsibility. So, in terms of like being there, I think it's the pre-coordination that, you all are talking about is very important. So one thing that really, when I was there, that I kind of prompted myself to do is just talk to people that I was standing in line next to, because the lines are ridiculously long. There's a line to get into the conference center. There's just lines everywhere. And so one of the things I told myself was, I'm just gonna tap on people's shoulders and start talking to them just to build connections. And it was interesting how so many people would ask me, so what's a doctor doing at COP? And, that was a great opportunity and a moment for me to start speaking about the health impacts of climate change. And from other health professionals who were there, I was told that if I understood correctly, it was the first year that the WHO had a health pavilion, and there were a lot of speakers and the health voice coming together internationally. It was a really good experience. And so the other big part of it was the pre-coordination and the coordination while we were there. So we had this giant WhatsApp group, and we would all be, kind of texting each other. We were organizing through Global Climate Health Alliance, GCHA. And so we had these things called the Healthy NDC cards. So how the NDCs are the nationally determined contributions, basically climate plans that each country comes up with. And so we had, GCHA had designed the Healthy NDCs. And so those were also a point that we could use to speak with, party members from different countries. What was really kind of interesting, I mean, we know this in the data form, but to actually be there and talk to people, developed countries, whenever I would speak to, some of the party delegates, it was more of this conversation about health impacts of climate change, but then I remember talking to a delegate from Kenya, and they were telling me about how extreme heat is impacting their population, and it was very apparent that those impacts are already have been happening in the global south, and that was also a very important moment of learning for me as well. So there's a lot to I felt that that was an important point to make sure that the health voice is continuing to be represented, and both in civil society conversations, but also in conversations with party delegates.
Very good. So what would you say is the role of non-governmental organizations in the COPs? The COPs are they're the conference of parties. They're only countries negotiating with countries. Why are non-governmental organizations there in the first place? And what do they do? Michael, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I'm going to also follow up with your ask to kind of introduce where we're from, just because I saw that as the question in the chat. So I'm Dene, or Navajo. Come from the kind of Four Corners region in the U.S. So I've lived in all four of those states. Parents live currently in Colorado, and then our reservation where I was born to was in Arizona, northeastern Arizona. Yeah, so the role of NGOs, I think it can play so many different roles, kind of depending on the program. I've had meetings with the State Department where, that year we were specifically doing a lot of big protests, big actions, big media. And we've had people even from the US State Department, even between the years of 2016 and 2020, who were telling us, keep doing what you're doing, because it helps put pressure on us and those who are giving us our red lines and the flexibility to negotiate here. And so that was one thing that was actually interesting, was kind of the role civil society can play in trying to make their voice heard, whether it's through protests, through written letters from op-eds, whatever it is, trying to just bring attention to these things and having more people want to speak out about these things, because that helps those that are negotiating be able to get a wider range of which they can negotiate within. I think it's also, again, there are so many ways that NGOs actually can start finding formal ways to participate in these negotiations. The UNFCCC now is so much bigger than just the state parties and the negotiations. So it's a great time, I think, for people to actually come together, strategize. A lot of the work that we do needs to kind of be, those stories back home need to be told broadly, because those that are making decisions at bigger, even international NGOs, they need to know the impacts of what their decisions have on communities, especially in the sense of climate, where people's actions do impact people globally. And so I think that's something that plays a huge role. And even, I guess, in a different formality, NGOs, a lot of them end up part of what are called constituencies, or these formal ways to engage with the negotiations process, where there are open seats to, I think at this point, 7 to 9 constituencies. So it includes young youth, environmental NGOs, the Indigenous Peoples Organizations, Ringo, the research network, and farmers specifically. So there's different ways that in each of these constituencies will have seats at most meetings, most open conversations. There's access to have a representative from each of those constituencies sit in, depending on the meeting, usually making statements and having a chance to give their position or intervention. It's the same thing at every closing and opening at COP, but then also lots of other meetings throughout the 2 weeks. So there are ways where bringing people together, they actually get to kind of make these statements and come up with what's really important from their constituency's point of view and their perspective. So that's specifically with my work with the Indigenous peoples, that's something that's so important and also extremely difficult, which is trying to kind of distill all of these stories and regions from around the world into one single voice and one 2-minute statement over and over again. So it it becomes kind of this, global challenge of how do we represent all of these different identities globally, but also an interesting and cool opportunity to really build those relationships and try to do it together.
Patricia, I don't know if you wanted to comment.
Sure. Actually, I'm in Phoenix today on my way back from the APHA meetings in Boston. So I apologize for the wonky service you're getting from me today. I'm on my phone instead of my laptop, so sorry about that. I wanted to raise a couple of things. First of all, I've been doing climate science for the last 50 or so years. Seen a lot of changes that have happened, both good and bad. And I guess the one thing that I can say that is a bottom line, a takeaway message that I try to bring out in everything that I do is that in climate science, the only thing that I have ever seen truly work is local solutions. And I think when we really have to look at that as being part of the answer, even when we're looking at large meetings like the COPs. The COPs are extremely important for looking at the big picture. But truthfully, where the action happens is in your own home community. It's in your own homelands. And that's what I think we need to keep in as an important part of this discussion as well. That's where I see that NGOs and all of those homegrown organizations play a really vital role, because they're the ones who are really taking care of what's happening in their own communities. They're the ones who are building up the energy solutions, the ones that are looking at climate impacts that are happening within their communities, whether it's from loss of sea ice, wildfires, all of these things that are devastating our communities. NGOs are the ones that really play a critical role in determining what's going to happen over the long term for the community's survival from a very holistic and from a very local perspective, and not just from the big picture and at COPs. So that's what I would hope we would remember, the importance of the COPs, but also the real importance of NGOs and community involvement.
But you were involved in circumpolar groups. That's an international group. Why would you do that if you're interested in local solutions?
Well, because again, because of that big picture, there is no such thing as there just being one issue that's going to solve all of our problems. The things that we're seeing here in the Arctic have come from other places besides our own communities. It's like all Indigenous communities, the impacts of climate change that we're seeing now really have come from decades of problems that we've seen from across the world. And that's from all of the greenhouse gases and everything else that's coming from the larger communities, the bigger cities, all of those other things that we have to be concerned with. That's why I understand what we're seeing in the Arctic is really critically important, because we have been at it for the last 40 or 50 years, where other people are kind of new to the game. We've been doing this for a long time, and I think the experience that we bring is really going to be helpful for the rest of the world and the survival for the rest of the world.
Very good. So Lolita, tell me about the role of health professionals. You started a little bit talking about that, but how does the role of health professionals, how do we engage at the COPs?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with both what Michael and Patricia were saying. I just wanted to share a couple of slides, if that's okay, with some pictures I have from COP. So just to kind of give you an idea, there is a lot going on at any given point in COP. And the areas are divided into like the blue zone and green zone. And then there's like whichever city is hosting will do a lot of activities. So this is the blue zone where all the delegates are, all the people in power are basically. There's the official negotiations that are happening. There's like tons of exhibits that you can go and see. There's also, each of the countries has their own kind of like what do you call like a presentation, a pavilion. So for example, the US has the US Climate Action Center, so that's happening. And in the green zone, there's a lot of, exchange of information, many civil society groups that are presenting their work and bidirectional learning that's happening. And I'm only sharing those pictures to kind of give you an idea of like, if you could spend one day in one tiny teeny little part of COP and engage in that particular way. But honestly, I think the biggest piece for me, I'm from India, I have an Indian passport, and just getting to Glasgow was this, the hoops you have to jump through to get a visa, and the whole like access piece, especially during COP. I could like note my own privilege of like, having been vaccinated and like having easy access to get there. And then through the university, like I had this research pass. So that allows me to get into the blue zone where people in power are. So that's another like huge piece of access that I had. And being there, being at these various presentations and just walking through the halls, like the Scottish Prime Minister, we're just like walking down the hall as I was going in that same direction. It's kind of impressive, like how much of access to power there is, and even our own representatives in power. So I think as health professionals, especially, that is our moment to make sure that the voices from the front lines are heard. Like if it was a very, I don't know how to describe that feeling, but we were in this conversation where we were, some members from Port Arthur, Texas, and some of the civil society NGOs were talking to representatives from the Department of Energy about LNG and plastic plants that were there. And, we're like, I'm not the one that's breathing in that air. I'm not the one suffering those impacts. And I have all this privilege. And, the people who need to be heard are not in the room where decisions are being made, decisions that are going to impact their health and well-being. And so it felt very important to me that as health professionals, when we present ourselves at COP, it's very important to bring that local work, bring that voices from front lines to people in power, make sure that we are heard, and make sure that the health voice is being represented.
Excellent. So my last question before opening up to the audience is about the U.S. government. Tell me about the U.S. government's role in COPs and your interaction with the U.S. government. And Lolita, you can go ahead and start.
Yeah, I think, we are obviously historically have a big carbon footprint and contribution to climate impact. So I think it is incumbent on the U.S. to, not only work to reduce emissions, but also participate in conversations of how do we make sure that, we address adaptation funding, how do we do loss and damage funding. So I think as members, like I think there's like a dual role that we play when we're at COP. Not only are we talking to our own, country, but we're also like making sure that we ensure that the both local and international participation is done in a proper manner. So what we did was mostly like, engage both in terms of like talking about the NDCs and how we make sure that piece happens, but also like bring up local issues like I was mentioning earlier. How do we make sure, we're not like exporting more LNG and things like that, which eventually does contribute to the, global carbon footprint.
Great, thank you. Michael?
Yeah, can you just ask the question again real quick?
Okay, I was asking about the relationship with the U.S. government, both the U.S. government within COP and then the relationship between NGOs, non-governmental organizations in the U.S.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, even that changes year after year. I think one thing to note specifically was under the Trump administration, US also pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And so their role at COP drastically changed right then. I mean, we still were there because we were still part of the UNFCCC, but it was one of the years where like nothing was really taken seriously by what we said. And the US was still trying to slow down even what the implementation of Paris was, because the Paris, they couldn't pull out until a certain time. So it was a very strange role that the United States played, particularly during that point. It was really the US Climate Action Network who had this whole campaign that said, you know, we're still in, trying to represent the civil society of the United States. And so they play very different roles. You know, now we're back with signed into the Paris Treaty or the Paris Agreement. And it's interesting. There are times when we are a pretty big powerhouse, a country that people, I mean, listen to in terms of being wealthy, being powerful, in the role that we play internationally. But I think it's also a lot of times taken with a grain of salt. I think a lot of times people also see us as one of the biggest polluters, one of the main reasons, and should be someone taking responsibility for a lot of these climate impacts as historically one of the largest polluters. So it's one of those where we play a big role, but it's not always the protagonist, I guess is the best way to say it. And what was the action group's name? The United States Climate Action Network is what I was saying. Sorry, I just saw that pop up in the chat. But so yeah, I think the role that the US plays changes often, but again, usually a big role adds, you know, sometimes we are leading good things and sometimes it's really a struggle. I will say the way that they interact with NGOs, there's a lot more discussions with fossil fuel industries and other corporations, with them more than you'll see with the environmental NGOs. There's a few different ways. So that, like I mentioned, that the Climate Action Network is actually another kind of whole umbrella group of environmental NGOs. That's usually kind of the main way we interact. We also get to interact usually with under the Indigenous peoples constituency, where we get to usually have a couple meetings, and we also have, as Native Americans, we have the Native or the National Congress of the American Indian, which is kind of another formal way to kind of establish connections between NGOs and even tribal nations directly to negotiators, White House climate advisors, and the State Department. So there's lots of, I guess, different interaction points and yeah.
And I also understand that this year there's a climate justice pavilion and organizing around climate justice, both US and internationally. Patricia, can you talk about the role of NGOs to push the US to comply with our commitments at these kinds of events?
Well, let me say that I'm glad, Michael, that things have changed somewhat since the times that I've been actively engaged with COP. It seems that you have at least been able to have discussions going on with John Kerry, with other people. I'll tell you that truthfully, in the past, that certainly did not happen. I think for me, it will be a telling sign when we actually have a local community organizer or an NGO that's part of the US delegation and part of the negotiation team. I have really yet to see that happen. I know that personally, I tried to get on the delegation, the US delegation, for about 10 years to no avail. To me, that would be a true sign of our having some input into the process, is when we're at the table, when we're truly at the table where they're making those kinds of decisions. In the meantime, the best we can do is to work with the NGOs and the people that we know and who we have established relationships and friendships with, that help to put forward our ideas and our desires. I can tell you that honestly, some of the best friends that we've had over the years have been people that you would not expect, people who come from a totally different industry, from media, from politics, from the movie industry, having had the opportunity to meet with people like Al Gore, like Prince Albert of Monaco, Brad Pitt, Kevin Costner. These are just some of the people that we had an opportunity as Indigenous groups to actually meet with and to have them help broaden our voice and our experience. So you kind of have to look at not just the usual people, but to look beyond the norm and to use some of those relationships that we've been able to form over the years to help spread the word that we're trying to get out as well.
Yeah, and I haven't participated in these COPs, but I participated in another negotiation around mercury, and it was important. Different countries are very interested in different aspects, and aligning countries or aligning regions and trying to get them the information. You know, NGOs have been major sources of information and expertise, you know, apart from industry, and so oftentimes it can be trusted more than some other sources of information. So let's go ahead and move to questions from the audience. Jordan, can you bring up the questions?
Sure. And thank you to all of our panelists for all that you shared and your insights, having attended COP. The first question I wanted to open up to any of you is there any collaboration between the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
Do you know, Patricia or Michael? Okay.
I can comment. Yeah, so all of the IPCC reports that are written typically are either adopted or ratified by the COP or by the UNFCCC. So there have been actual times where the reports have come out from the IPCC and people have just kind of rejected it as within the UNFCCC as things that they weren't really going to take seriously, things like that, where there is a relationship, but it's mostly, you know, the IPCC kind of does their thing and then the UNFCCC kind of comments whether or not they care, if that makes sense. And so there is a relationship, but there's not really a formal, as far as I know, input from the UNFCCC into, well, I guess there is input in terms of the UNFCCC kind of talks about what's needed for science, or based on the conversations the IPCC picks, like their special reports and things like that. So for instance, like the report on 1.5 degrees was a direct result of the Paris Agreement, and that being something that was decided upon. So there is kind of that. And then kind of once they say here's some kind of research needs, then they're not really part of the research methodology or anything like that, as far as I know. And then they kind of decide whether they accept the science or not, and how they kind of react to those reports.
Thank you. Next question.
Thanks, Michael. Lolita, this question for you. What can be done to raise the issue of climate, health, and equity during UN climate meetings?
Yeah, I think currently, you know, just having the WHO pavilion, I think is a big step. And there's like lots of there's a whole day agenda of people speaking, and from what I've seen last year and this year, the focus is on a lot of different things. So, you know, for example, on curriculum worldwide, where how are we educating ourselves and medical students, there's emphasis on, you know, healthcare sustainability and how we do that, and learning from best practices from, you know, across the world. And there's also a lot of organization within both the health constituents as well as like the medical students, both before and like during and after COP, pretty much trying to make sure that we are able to include health in the language, and making sure that health is being considered as an impact, especially like the inequitable health impacts that certain populations are suffering because of climate change, and making sure that that is under consideration when we come up with these NDCs. I think that's a lot of like international coordination. It was something that I was not aware of until I went to COP last year, and it's very encouraging to see all the work that's being done across the world. Oh, I'm just going to add that like GCHA is a great organization, as well as Healthcare Without Harm, who organize health professionals from across the country, across the world. So I can put those links in the chat.
So yeah, again, people can continue to put questions and comments into the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. Jordan, though, I think we're going to.
Yeah, I wanted to see if I could get this one question to Patricia before passing it back to Dr. Curry. Wanted to, Patricia, if you're available, get your insights on how much greenwashing by industry occurs at COP.
I don't really have an answer to that.
Okay, Michael or Lolita?
I can kind of talk about it. I will say there's definitely an influence of the greenwashing and the way. I guess one example is the way every kind of country talks about their own accomplishments every year. So right, in a lot of ways, this can kind of just become a showcase where they try to put on their best face. Here's everything we did. Here's some of the data, but it also doesn't tell all the things that they did wrong. That's like there's always examples and counterexamples against what they're kind of boasting and putting forward. And then in terms of how industry kind of also co-ops it, there's tons of times where there are plenty of interest groups and representation. So there's also a business constituency. And you'll even see countries meeting with fossil fuel reps or even big industry reps. And I've seen conversations happen in a circle and then kind of those countries come up onto the table and completely change what they were saying. Then you also see power imbalances between countries as well, where they kind of can bully people by making them change a vote for something and because they can withdraw something else that they've agreed. So hopefully that's an answer.
I know that this discussion can go on much longer, but we do need to wrap up. We would like to thank our speakers for all of your participation in this really excellent panel and for your participation in the webinar series. I hope that everyone found it useful. As a reminder, these webinars are held on the second Friday of the month. This does conclude our webinar series for 2022, but the new series will begin in April of 2023. Before you leave, we ask you to take a moment to complete the webinar survey if you haven't already. The link is in the chat. And then we want to acknowledge the support for this webinar series was made possible with funding from Johnson & Johnson, the Energy Foundation, the American Medical Association, and the American College of Physicians. Thank you to all of our sponsors, and thank you, our audience, for listening and for participating. This now concludes our session. Have a great day and happy Veterans Day.
Thank you, everyone.